Our last concept for this chapter is concept 52.4. It says interactions between organisms and the environment limit the distribution of species. So earlier in this chapter we talked about, for example, why are there mosquitoes pretty much almost all around the world except for in the very coldest or perhaps driest areas. But say, for example, polar bears can only be found in a very small part of the world, or rhinoceros can only be found in a very small part of the world, and those species tend to or seem to be possibly going extinct. There are fewer and fewer of them than there used to be. Well, that has a lot to do with man's activity, and that is part of the overall interaction between living creatures and their environment. But it also has I'm sorry, I'm tripping over my words here. It also points to the fact that environmental conditions play a part in where these animals live. Obviously, polar bears are well adapted to their home environment of, say, Alaska or northern Canada, but if we began to do things that change that environment, not so sure that they're going to be able to adapt fast enough to overcome those changes. So the interaction between organisms and their environment really limits where in the world you will find those creatures. There are some creatures like flies and mosquitoes that are very adaptable and can live in a huge range of environments, and there are other creatures like a polar bear that can only really live in a very limited range of environments. Species distributions are the result of two different things. One of those is what we call ecological interaction, and the other one is evolutionary interaction. Ecological interaction, ecological time, is the minute to minute, day to day sort of interaction between organisms and their environment. It's the short term, the small picture. Evolutionary interaction and evolutionary time is the long term, big picture. This is many generations, not just one particular creature, but many generations, and how they adapt and change through natural selection over a longer period of time. There are events that can happen on a day-to-day basis that have an effect on the long-term evolutionary time scale as well. A good example is the Galapagos finches that we've described before, that we've talked about when we discussed evolution, that we discussed with Charles Darwin. And what happened, we noticed, was on that particular island, Daphne Major. This was actually something that was studied again in the 70s and 80s when there was a particular drought, and it killed off a lot of the plants, and some of the plants that were left only had the large seeds. Well, the birds that did best were the birds that have the larger beaks that could open and crush and crack the large seeds. And so you saw a fairly quick evolutionary change that occurred just in a matter of 20 or 30 years, where these birds, their population grew, and some of the other birds, their population declined. So the average beak size began to be larger in the next generations, and this resulted in a long-term evolutionary change. But it actually began from a short-term, day-by-day drought sort of instance or activity. So what happens in the short term can have long-term effects. Living and non-living factors both kind of influence a species distribution. So for example, if we want to look at, if we go to Australia, the only place you're going to find kangaroos is in Australia. And if you're going to look at a particular kangaroo, like the red kangaroo you see here, you're not going to find him in all of Australia. You're only going to find him in certain areas. He is well adapted to particular climates and particular parts of that ecosystem. So the interaction between the living and non-living parts of the environment affect his distribution. And if you want to look at where are the most kangaroos, you're going to find these darker red areas right around in here. And so you notice, are there a lot of kangaroos near the coastlines? And the answer for the most part is no. Kangaroos tend to be for the most part in the drier, more arid areas of Australia, and they tend to be grouped in certain areas because of the environmental conditions found there. So you won't find these red kangaroos equally spread throughout the entire continent of Australia. You will find them kind of concentrated in certain areas because of the biotic and abiotic factors in that area. So if you're an ecologist and you're studying a particular animal, you might follow a flow chart as to when you're asking yourself where species occur and why species occur where they do. So here's a cool little flow chart that you could kind of ask yourself to try to figure out, okay, is this animal in this area? And if it is, or if it is not, why or why not? So you might say, why is this species not in this area? So like for your area in Waxahachie or here in Tyler, Texas, why are there polar bears not in this area? And you might start to go through this particular flow chart to find out the reason for polar bears not being in our particular area. One of the things you're going to look at is dispersal and distribution. Dispersal and distribution is the movement of individuals away from high population centers out to more far-reaching areas. A good example in plants is what you see right here, a dandelion. On the top of that dandelion there is a high concentration of the dandelion seeds, and so they have a method of dispersal where they use the wind to try to spread those seeds as far as possible. So plants, of course, and animals both do this dispersal technique to try to spread out and increase the zone that they can live in, but they can't live everywhere. A dandelion seed won't grow in every spot that it lands. It has to have the right conditions. And a polar bear, they will try to disperse and spread their range, but they're only going to go so far because they're only well adapted to a particular set of circumstances. There are some creatures who can be well adapted to a variety of ecosystems or places, but they have to have a way to get there. For example, think about Hawaii. Hawaii and a lot of islands like Hawaii have relatively few land snakes. That doesn't mean that snakes couldn't do well in Hawaii. I'm sure that snakes would love Hawaii. I mean, it's perfect conditions for them. But there was never a way for the snakes, the land snakes, to get there to Hawaii. So unless they were accidentally introduced by sailors or onboard ships or boxes that came to Hawaii, you wouldn't find them there, even though they could do very well there. The flip side of that is something like the cattle egret. If you have ever gone out to some farmland in North Texas here, you've seen these birds, the cattle egrets that walk around in the pastures and sometimes stand on the backs of the cattle. The cattle egrets really arrived in the Americas in the late 1800s and have dispersed and expanded their range ever since then. So the cattle egrets actually are originally from South America, but you see where they have grown and increased their range to where now you can find cattle egrets throughout the entire United States and including the coastal areas of South America. So these birds, as they slowly spread and dispersed, they increase their range a greater and greater amount. They're very adaptable, and they can obviously live in a wide variety of conditions. So if that dispersal or distribution process occurs naturally, we think about it just as those terms, dispersal or distribution. But sometimes it's kind of done in an unnatural way. We might consider that a transplant, where, for example, a creature is brought to a new place sort of accidentally or sometimes on purpose, but it was brought there with a particular goal in mind. Like, for example, in the again, islands are a great example of this, where you maybe don't have, say, rats or pigs on that particular island, and then man comes to the island, and on his ship he has rats and pigs, and so that is kind of a species transplant. They're introduced, oftentimes on purpose, oftentimes accidentally. Sometimes this can be helpful, but oftentimes this can be harmful. There's something called invasive species, which is where a species comes into a new area, not its original area, and begins to take over. Like in the South, there's a vine called kudzu, and if you've ever seen this vine can grow all over, and particularly it's very heavy in parts of Georgia, around Atlanta, Georgia in the South. And this kudzu vine, which I think is originally from like from Vietnam, that area, it has done tremendously well in southern United States and has become a major problem. It's an invasive species. It's a transplant, and I don't know if it was brought here on purpose and just got out of control, or maybe it was accidental, but either way it would be a transplanted species. Of course, there are living factors that affect how far a species will disperse, how wide its range is going to be. That's going to be predation. All living creatures have enemies that might want to eat them and kill them. If you're talking about a plant, it might be herbivory. So certain plants can only spread a certain distance because, again, there might be animals or other creatures that would eat them as well. And competition, of course. You have to compete for homes and food and light and whatever resources you need. So that might kind of limit how far you're going to be able to to go. Here's a good example of seaweed distribution. These two little creatures, sea urchins and limpets, eat seaweed, and you can see if you remove some of these creatures, you can increase the percentage of seaweed that covers a particular area. So down here, the red and blue lines, this is where the control, which is the red line, this is where the urchins and the limpets are present, and look how the spread, the percentage of seaweed cover pretty much doesn't change. And then if you take away the limpets, you still don't have a lot of change. But look what happens if you take away the sea urchins. Their percentage of seaweed cover goes up tremendously, and if you take away both of these guys that feed on the seaweed, you get a huge percentage increase in seaweed cover. So you can see herbivory is what keeps this seaweed in check and what keeps it from spreading farther and farther. There are also non-living factors that affect how far a creature can go. Like, for example, we're talking about the polar bears. Polar bears are not going to be able to live in Waxahachie, Texas, even if you brought one, because of the weather conditions, the temperature, the water, the sunlight, the wind, the rocks, the soil. They're not adapted to the weather of Waxahachie, Texas, and they would not do well even if you were to introduce them into this area. So not only do they not have their normal food source, they don't have their normal habitat and environment. So there's living and non-living things that would affect how far a polar bear can range and where it can live. Things like temperature, again, a polar bear is well adapted to temperatures in Alaska, but not so well adapted to temperatures here in Texas. Environmental temperature is a very important factor that limits the distribution of plants and animals. You can only get, for most creatures, you can only get to a certain level of cold because, of course, your body is primarily made up of water, and cells can freeze and rupture below the freezing point of water, and most proteins start to denature above 45 degrees Celsius. So you can't live in the hottest or coldest areas. Most creatures can't, simply because they're not physically able to survive. Mammals and birds can tend to live in some colder areas because they expend a lot of energy to maintain homeostasis, internal temperature. Here you have a Japanese macaque, a type of a monkey here, that he actually has found a behavioral adaptation to living in the cold parts of Japan. They gather in these hot springs, like in Hot Springs, Arkansas, or think about the hot thermal pools in Wyoming, in the national parks in Wyoming. Well, there are parts of Japan that have these natural hot springs, and these monkeys will gather and they will spend the winters in and around these hot springs to stay warm in the cold winter of the Japanese mountains where they live. Doesn't matter if you're talking about a water environment or a land environment, the amount of water and oxygen is very important. All living creatures are going to require water and oxygen in some way or some form. So water availability is a very important factor. Of course, desert conditions, you can only have certain creatures that are adapted to live in those hot, dry areas. Oxygen availability, again, sometimes you don't find a lot of living creatures in water that is low oxygen because there's just not enough for them to survive. So oxygen concentrations can be very low in the deep parts of oceans and the deep parts of lakes, and you might not find a lot of living creatures down there where the oxygen levels are very low. Salinity is very important, the percentage of salt we talked about. You can't really take a freshwater fish and dump him in the ocean. He's probably not going to survive. The salt concentration affects the water balance inside their body, and so you have to have the right adaptations to live in salt water, or you have to have the right adaptations to live in freshwater. You couldn't normally take a saltwater ocean fish and dump it in a lake and expect it to survive either. And then most land creatures have to have this right balance, and they couldn't live in areas that were too high in salts or too low in amounts of water. So the amount of water and salt has to be in balance for the creature you're talking about as well. Finally, if we're talking about primarily plants, you would have to definitely mention sunlight. Different parts of the world get different amounts of sunlight, and different plants are adapted to certain amounts of sunlight. The intensity of the light and the quality or the wavelength of the light can have a big effect on photosynthesis. So some plants are well adapted to the harsh, bright, direct sunlight of deserts, and some of them are more adapted to more shady areas or less intense light that you might find, say, in the lower areas of a tropical rainforest. fast. So high amounts of light can stress plants as well as low amounts. It depends on the creature and how they are adapted to their environment. So if you took a fern that normally grows in a shady area and put it in a high sunlight area, it's probably going to burn and do damage and not survive. And if you took a cactus and try to grow it in the shade, you're probably going to find it doesn't do well either. It has to have the right amount of sunlight for its adaptations. A good example is a tree line. If you've ever been to the mountains, if you've ever been to Colorado or someplace like this is in Canada at Banff National Park in Canada. You see as you go up the mountainside, there tends to be this point, this kind of imaginary line where all the trees suddenly stop, and we call that the tree line. And the reason the trees stop is as you go higher, there's less moisture, the temperatures get colder, and you just reach a point where the trees cannot do very well above a certain point. So it's almost like this imaginary line. Above that line, the conditions are just not very well suited for trees. Below that line, you can see there's more water, the temperatures are warmer, and so they have what they need to survive. Finally, again, we're still talking mainly about plants, rocks and soil conditions, the type of soil, the pH of the soil, the chemical makeup of the soil, the mineral composition. These all have a big effect. Certain plants do best in certain types of soil, and the types of plants affect the types of animals, so it all kind of plays a part there. Again, in the coming chapters, we're going to continue to learn about ecology and animal behavior in response to their surroundings. So the last part of our biology lesson, last part of our biology semester, is about sort of big picture ideas and more about ecology rather than studying any one individual creature or one individual part of a single creature. I really highly suggest you go take a look at the crash course videos. There's a crash course video in this chapter 52 folder about ecology, and they're very good. And again, for the excerpt chapters that I didn't make a vodcast over, I would definitely use the crash course videos to help you out there. See me online or send me an email if you have any questions. And again, for exam number 3 will be chapter 34, chapter 40, chapter 52, and all the excerpt chapters we talked about. And then for quiz number 6, which is what's coming up, quiz number 6 will cover chapter 40 and the excerpts from chapter 41 through 50. And if you have any questions, just let me know. I'll make a post online for a discussion, an open discussion for probably for the next few days as we get ready to come back into quiz number 6, and you can post a question there or you can email me directly. Other than that, have a great day. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.